Get on the ground. Now! The officer's voice cut through the wedding reception like a knife through silk, silencing the laughter and music in an instant. Tony Mahone's hands instinctively rose as 3 patrol cars' flashing lights painted the elegant ballroom in alternating red and blue. His new wife Annie's wedding dress rustled as she stepped protectively in front of him, her bouquet trembling in her grip. "There's been a mistake," Tony said calmly, his prosecutorial training kicking in despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "I'm the groom. This is my wedding. Shut up and get down." Officer Bradley McKenzie's hand moved to his taser, his partner flanking left. "We got reports of a black male threatening guests and causing a disturbance." The irony wasn't lost on Tony that he'd spent the morning reviewing police misconduct cases in his federal courthouse office, never imagining he'd become one by evening. His grandmother's pearl cufflinks, a family heirloom, caught the harsh police lights as he slowly knelt on the marble floor where he'd danced with Annie just moments before. "Tony Mahone, Assistant U.S. Attorney," he said quietly, hoping his title might restore sanity to the situation. "Badge number 47291. You can verify." "I said shut up." Mackenzie's knee found Tony's back, pressing his face against the cold marble. Around them, wedding guests pulled out phones, the clicking of cameras mixing with Annie's quiet sobs. What Mackenzie didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this wasn't just any federal prosecutor. Tony Mahone had spent the last 6 months building an airtight case against police corruption that reached the highest levels of this very department. "Hey, my friend, hope you're doing well. Drop a comment and let me know how you're feeling about this story so far and where you are watching from." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Tony caught sight of his wedding photographer still recording, and a grim satisfaction mixed with his humiliation. Every second of this nightmare was being documented, and tomorrow, these officers would learn they'd just arrested the one man with the power to make them all pay. The holding cell's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Tony sat in his torn tuxedo, his bow tie hanging loose around his neck. 6 hours had passed since Mackenzie's knee had pressed him into the marble floor. 6 hours since his perfect wedding had become a viral nightmare. Through the concrete walls, he could hear phones ringing incessantly. The media storm had already begun. Tony closed his eyes and thought of Annie. They'd met 3 years ago during a civil rights symposium, where she'd challenged his presentation on prosecutorial reform with a brilliant counterargument about systemic bias. She was a constitutional law professor at Georgetown, and their first date had lasted 14 hours. Dinner turning into coffee, coffee into a midnight walk along the Potomac. What she didn't know, what he'd never told her, was why he'd become a federal prosecutor in the first place. Detective Susan Keene appeared at his cell, her Asian features tight with professional concern. She was internal affairs, and Tony had worked with her before on corruption cases, though never from this side of the bars. "They're claiming you threatened Officer Mahone's wife," Keene said quietly, sliding a folder through the slot. "Says you approached her aggressively, made comments about her husband being a dirty cop." Tony's blood chilled. Officer Jake Mahone, no relation despite the shared surname, was the subject of his current investigation. 3 months of wiretaps, financial records, and witness testimony had built an ironclad case against Mahone's involvement in evidence tampering and witness intimidation. "Susan, you know that's impossible. I've never met Mahone's wife, and I certainly wouldn't." "The call came from Mackenzie," Keene interrupted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He was off duty, attending your wedding as a guest. Says he witnessed the whole thing." The betrayal hit Tony like ice water. Bradley Mackenzie wasn't just some random officer responding to a call. He was Annie's cousin's boyfriend. He'd been invited to their wedding, had shaken Tony's hand during the receiving line, had eaten at their table. "He was at our wedding," Tony whispered, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. "Annie's cousin Rachel brought him as her plus one." Keene's expression darkened. "Mackenzie called in the complaint 20 minutes after your first dance. Said you'd been drinking heavily and became belligerent when you spotted Mahone's wife across the ballroom. But Tony hadn't been drinking. He never drank at professional events, a habit formed during his years as a prosecutor. More importantly, Officer Jake Mahone's wife wasn't even at the wedding. Tony would have recognized her from the surveillance photos in his case files. The setup was becoming clear, and it was more sophisticated than a simple racist arrest. Someone had orchestrated this specifically to neutralize him before his corruption case could go to trial. "Where's Annie?" Tony asked, his voice cracking slightly. Keene's silence spoke volumes before she finally answered. "She's been trying to see you for hours." But Mackenzie filed additional charges an hour ago: assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, and public intoxication. The magistrate set bail at $50,000. Tony's wedding ring felt heavy on his finger as he processed the implications. By morning, every news outlet would be running stories about the violent federal prosecutor who had to be subdued at his own wedding. His reputation, built over years of meticulous legal work, was being systematically destroyed. "Susan," he said quietly, looking directly into her eyes. "You know me. You know this isn't who I am." For a moment, Keene's professional mask slipped, revealing genuine sympathy. "I know, Tony. But the body camera footage, it doesn't look good. And Mackenzie's testimony is going to be hard to discredit." As Keene walked away, Tony realized the true genius of the setup. They hadn't just arrested him. They'd carefully constructed a scenario that would destroy his credibility as a prosecutor while simultaneously derailing his investigation into police corruption. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated Annie, and they had no idea what Tony Mahone was truly capable of when someone threatened the people he loved. Outside the detention center, Annie Mahone stood in her wedding dress, now wrinkled and stained with tears, facing a wall of reporters and camera lights. Her constitutional law background had taught her about media strategy, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. "Mrs. Mahone, do you believe your husband's actions were racially motivated?" a reporter shouted. The question hit like a slap. Annie's hands trembled as she stepped closer to the microphones, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "My husband is one of the most ethical men I know. He spent his career fighting for justice, including investigating police misconduct. What happened tonight wasn't about anything he did. It was about who he is and what he represents." Behind the cameras, she spotted Rachel, her own cousin, standing next to Bradley Mackenzie. Rachel's face was pale, her eyes avoiding Annie's gaze. Mackenzie wore a slight smile that made Annie's stomach turn. The betrayal ran deeper than she'd initially realized. Rachel had been her maid of honor, had helped plan every detail of the wedding. She'd insisted on bringing Mackenzie as her date, had specifically requested he be seated at the family table. "The investigation into police corruption my husband has been leading," Annie continued, her voice growing stronger, "involves millions in taxpayer money and reaches the highest levels of law enforcement. Tonight's events weren't random, they were calculated." As she spoke, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Drop the case, or this is just the beginning. Your husband's career is over unless he backs down." The message confirmed what she'd suspected. This wasn't about a wedding night misunderstanding. This was about silencing Tony before he could expose a corruption network that had millions of dollars and dozens of careers at stake. But the text had been a mistake. Threatening a federal prosecutor's wife was a federal crime, and now they had evidence of a conspiracy. Annie looked directly into the nearest camera, her wedding dress billowing in the evening breeze. "To whoever orchestrated tonight's events," she said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd argued cases before the Supreme Court, "you just made the biggest mistake of your lives. You didn't just arrest Tony Mahone, you declared war on the law itself." As she walked back toward the detention center, her mind was already working through the legal implications. Conspiracy to obstruct justice, civil rights violations, witness intimidation. The charges were piling up. They'd wanted to destroy Tony's credibility, but instead, they'd given him the most powerful motivation a prosecutor could have: personal vindication through the legal system he'd sworn to serve. The war was just beginning, and Annie Mahone wasn't just a grieving bride. She was a constitutional law expert with access to resources that would make their attackers' lives very complicated. Dawn broke over the city as Tony finally made bail, thanks to a legal fund hastily organized by his colleagues at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Annie met him at the detention center entrance, both of them surrounded by a fresh wave of reporters and protesters who'd gathered overnight. The viral videos had done their work. #JusticeForTony was trending nationally, but so was #BadProsecutor, as the police department's carefully crafted narrative spread through social media. In their car, driving through streets lined with protesters both supporting and condemning Tony, Annie shared what she'd discovered during his detention. "Rachel's been dating Mackenzie for 8 months, she said, her voice tight with betrayal. But she lied to me about how they met. She didn't meet him at a coffee shop. She met him at a police union event specifically organized to identify potential intelligence sources." Tony absorbed this information while watching his reputation crumble in real time on social media. Videos of his arrest played on endless loops, with pundits debating whether a federal prosecutor could be trusted to investigate police misconduct after being arrested for assaulting officers. "There's more," Annie continued. "I pulled financial records on Rachel's law firm. They've received 3 anonymous donations totaling $40,000 in the past 2 months, all from shell companies that trace back to the police union's legal defense fund." The sophistication of the operation was becoming clear. They hadn't just planted Mackenzie at the wedding. They'd been cultivating Rachel as an intelligence asset for months, positioning her to provide inside information about Tony's investigation and personal life. Tony's phone rang constantly, reporters, colleagues, family members all wanting statements, explanations, reassurances. His mother called from Atlanta, crying, having seen the arrest footage on CNN. "Baby, what really happened?" she whispered through the phone. "They're saying you attacked police officers." The pain in his mother's voice cut deeper than any professional consequence. She'd raised him alone after his father was killed during a routine traffic stop when Tony was 12. Shot by an officer who later claimed he'd felt threatened, despite dashboard camera footage showing Tony's father complying with every instruction. That moment had shaped everything about Tony's career choice. He'd become a prosecutor not despite his experience with police violence, but because of it. He believed the system could be reformed from within, that good cops could be distinguished from bad ones through careful legal work. Now, 20 years later, he was living proof that nothing had changed. At their apartment, they found their building surrounded by protesters and media. Neighbors they'd known for years now looked at them with suspicion and fear. Their landlord had already called twice about security concerns and potential lease violations. Inside their home, Annie showed Tony the most disturbing discovery. Hidden in their wedding gifts was a small recording device, disguised as a decorative frame. Someone had been listening to their private conversations in their own home. "How long has this been here?" Tony asked, examining the sophisticated surveillance equipment. "I don't know, but look at this." Annie pulled up a series of encrypted emails on her laptop. "I hacked into Rachel's personal account. She's been reporting our conversations to someone codenamed Blue Guardian for 3 months." The emails detailed everything: Tony's investigation timeline, witness lists, evidence repositories, legal strategies. Their most intimate conversations about the stress of the corruption case, their wedding plans, even their concerns about Tony's safety. Rachel hadn't just betrayed their family relationship. She'd compromised a federal investigation that could send dozens of people to prison. As they read through the emails, another devastating realization emerged. The corruption network Tony was investigating wasn't limited to local police. It reached into federal agencies, including his own office. Someone with access to federal resources had been orchestrating this operation from the beginning, using sophisticated surveillance and carefully planned legal maneuvers to destroy Tony before he could present his case. The war they were fighting wasn't just against a few corrupt cops. It was against a network that had infiltrated the very system Tony had spent his career serving. The internal affairs meeting took place in a sterile conference room that smelled of cleaning solution and broken dreams. Tony sat across from Chief Patricia Williams, Detective Susan Keene, and 3 federal investigators he didn't recognize. His own supervisor, Deputy U.S. Attorney Robert Hayes, sat at the far end of the table, avoiding eye contact. "We're suspending your prosecution privileges pending the outcome of the criminal investigation," Hayes announced, his voice carrying none of the warmth that had characterized their 10-year working relationship. Tony felt the ground shifting beneath him. "Robert, you know this arrest was orchestrated. The evidence shows you assaulted 3 police officers at your wedding," one of the federal investigators interrupted. "Body camera footage clearly shows you resisting arrest and making threatening statements." Detective Keene slid a tablet across the table. The video played silently, showing Tony being forced to the ground, but the audio had been carefully edited. His calm explanations had been replaced with aggressive-sounding snippets taken from other parts of the evening, making it appear he was shouting threats while being arrested. "This has been doctored," Tony said immediately. "The audio doesn't match the video timeline." "That's a serious accusation," Chief Williams replied coolly. "Are you suggesting multiple officers conspired to frame a federal prosecutor? The irony would have been laughable if it weren't destroying his life." "Yes, that's exactly what I'm suggesting." Hayes finally looked at him directly, And Tony saw something that chilled him more than the edited video. Pity mixed with calculation. "Tony, I've reviewed your corruption investigation. The evidence is circumstantial at best. Maybe it's time to consider that you've been seeing conspiracies where none exist." The betrayal hit like a physical blow. Hayes had been his mentor, had recommended him for the federal prosecutor position, had attended his wedding just days ago. Now he was suggesting Tony was delusional. "The wiretaps alone," Tony began, "are inadmissible due to procedural irregularities," Hayes interrupted. "Your informants have recanted their statements. The financial evidence has been challenged by defense attorneys who found significant gaps in the chain of custody." One by one, Hayes dismantled 3 years of Tony's work with surgical precision. Every piece of evidence was tainted, every witness compromised, every legal strategy anticipated and countered. "You're not just suspending me," Tony realized aloud. "You're destroying the entire investigation." Chief Williams leaned forward, her expression almost sympathetic. "Mr. Mahone, perhaps it's time to consider that your personal experiences with law enforcement have created biases that affect your professional judgment." The psychological manipulation was expertly crafted. They were reframing his lived experience as a liability, his commitment to justice as a pathology. As Tony left the building, his federal credentials confiscated, he called Annie with hands that shook from rage rather than fear. "They didn't just frame me," he told her. "They've been planning this for years." Hayes, keen, maybe even people at Justice Department headquarters. "The corruption goes higher than I ever imagined." Annie's voice was steady when she replied. "Then we stop playing by their rules." "What do you mean?" "I mean, we don't fight this in their courts, with their evidence, according to their procedures. We expose everything publicly, simultaneously, before they can spin or suppress it." Tony understood. They were going to war not just against corrupt police officers, but against the entire system that protected them. And they were going to use the one weapon the corruption network couldn't control: the truth delivered directly to the American people. But first, they had to survive long enough to tell it. The death threats began arriving within hours of Tony's suspension becoming public. Voices on voicemails promising to finish what should have been done years ago. Photos slipped under their apartment door showing Tony and Annie at various locations around the city, with red X's marked over their faces. Annie's law school had placed her on administrative leave, pending resolution of the family situation, effectively ending her tenure-track position. Their joint bank accounts were frozen as part of a federal investigation into potential corruption related to Tony's cases. "They're systematically destroying our entire lives," Annie said, staring at their laptop screen where anonymous social media accounts had posted their home address, phone numbers, and daily routines. Tony sat in their living room, surrounded by boxes of legal documents he'd copied before his suspension. Everything felt futile. Years of meticulous investigation reduced to circumstantial evidence that would never see a courtroom. "Maybe I should just give up the case," he said quietly. "Take whatever plea deal they're offering and disappear somewhere." It was the first time Annie had heard defeat in his voice, and it terrified her more than the threats. "You don't understand," she said, kneeling beside his chair. "If you give up now, every corrupt cop in America learns they can destroy any prosecutor who threatens them. Every family like yours, every father like yours, dies for nothing." The words hit their target. Tony's father had died believing the system would eventually deliver justice. 20 years later, his son was learning that the system was designed to protect itself, not the people it served. Their doorbell rang at midnight. Through the peephole, they saw Rachel standing alone, tears streaming down her face. "Don't answer it," Tony warned, but Annie was already unlocking the door. Rachel collapsed into Annie's arms, sobbing. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. They said they just wanted information about his work schedule, his cases. I didn't know they were planning to." "Planning to what?" Annie demanded. Rachel's next words changed everything. "They're going to kill him. Tonight. Mackenzie and 2 other officers are coming here to stage a home invasion. They're going to say Tony attacked them with a weapon." Tony felt the room spinning. The corruption network hadn't just wanted to discredit him. They'd wanted him dead from the beginning. The arrest, the suspension, the media campaign were all preludes to murder disguised as self-defense. "How long do we have?" Annie asked, her constitutional law training overriding her emotional shock. "Maybe an hour. Mackenzie thinks I'm keeping watch outside. He doesn't know I'm warning you." Tony was already moving, grabbing laptops, files, backup drives containing copies of all his evidence. If they survived the night, they'd need proof of everything. Why? Annie asked Rachel. Why did you help them? Rachel's answer revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. They have photos of me taking bribes from defense attorneys, falsified evidence in cases I worked on as a paralegal. If I didn't cooperate, I was going to prison. But I never thought they'd try to. She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The corruption network had compromised dozens of people throughout the legal system, creating an army of reluctant accomplices who were too scared to resist. As they prepared to flee their home, Tony realized they weren't just fighting for his reputation anymore. They were fighting for their lives against people who controlled police departments, federal agencies, and enough of the justice system to kill with impunity. But they had one advantage their enemies didn't expect. They were no longer playing defense. They were about to become the most dangerous thing a corrupt system could face. Victims with nothing left to lose and the legal expertise to destroy everything. The abandoned warehouse outside the city felt like a tomb as Tony, Annie, and Rachel waited in the darkness, listening for the sound of approaching vehicles. They had maybe 30 minutes before Mackenzie and his team realized Rachel wasn't coming back. Tony's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Return the files and surrender yourself, or everyone you've ever cared about pays the price. Your mother, your sister, your law school friends. We have people everywhere. Attached was a photo of Tony's mother at her church in Atlanta, taken less than an hour ago, with a red laser dot visible on her chest. They're not bluffing, Annie whispered, seeing the photo over his shoulder. These people have resources we can't fight. Tony stared at the ultimatum, feeling the weight of his father's death pressing against his chest like a physical force. 20 years ago, his father had died because he'd trusted the system. Now Tony faced the same choice: surrender and hope for mercy, or fight and watch everyone he loved pay the price. Rachel's phone rang. Mackenzie's name appeared on the screen. Answer it, Tony instructed. Act normal. We need to know where they are. Rachel's hands shook as she accepted the call. Hey, Brad. Everything's quiet here. Good. We're 5 minutes out. Once we're inside, you disappear. Walk away and never mention tonight to anyone. Rachel's voice was steady when she replied. I understand. After she hung up, she looked at Tony with desperate eyes. There's something else. The corruption investigation you've been building. It's not about stealing money or planting evidence. It's about human trafficking. Young girls, mostly immigrants, being moved through the city under police protection. Tony felt his worldview shift again. The stakes weren't just corruption or cover-ups. Children were being sold while police officers provided security and federal prosecutors looked the other way. The evidence is in my apartment, Rachel continued. Hidden in my law books. Financial records, shipping manifests, surveillance photos. Mackenzie doesn't know I have it. Annie grabbed Tony's arm. We have to make a choice. Try to run and hide forever, or end this tonight. Tony thought about his father, about the dashboard camera footage showing his compliance and cooperation, about the officer who'd walked free after claiming self-defense. He thought about children being trafficked while prosecutors worried about their careers and judges worried about their pensions. We end it, Tony decided. But not the way they expect. He pulled out his phone and called Detective Susan Keene, hoping she wasn't part of the conspiracy. Susan, it's Tony. I need you to listen carefully. Mackenzie and at least 2 other officers are about to stage my murder. I'm sending you GPS coordinates. If you want to save whatever integrity the department has left, you'll be there with federal backup in the next 20 minutes. Keene's response would determine whether they lived or died. Tony, I've been investigating this corruption network for 2 years. I know about the trafficking, the murders, all of it. I've been waiting for someone with the legal standing to help me expose everything. The revelation hit like lightning. Not everyone in the system was corrupted. Some people were still fighting from within, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Can you stop Mackenzie? Tony asked. I can do better than that. I can give you everything you need to destroy the entire network. But you have to trust me, and you have to be willing to risk everything on one final play. As Tony looked at Annie and Rachel, both of whom had sacrificed everything to stand with him, he realized this moment would define not just his life, but the lives of every victim the corruption network had ever claimed. The impossible choice wasn't between surrender and resistance. It was between accepting incremental justice or demanding complete transformation of a system that had failed too many people for too long. Tell me what you need, Tony said. The warehouse erupted in organized chaos as federal agents, city police, and internal affairs descended simultaneously from three directions. Detective Keene had orchestrated the operation with surgical precision, using Mackenzie's planned home invasion as the centerpiece of a massive sting operation 2 years in the making. Tony watched through night vision equipment as Mackenzie and two other officers approached the warehouse, believing they were walking into an execution. Instead, they were walking into the largest police corruption bust in the city's history. Keene played both sides perfectly, Annie whispered, watching agents surround the building. She let them think she was compromised while building cases against all of them. But the night's biggest revelation was yet to come. As Mackenzie was being arrested, his phone rang. Keene answered it on speaker, and the voice that emerged made Tony's blood freeze. "Is it done?" Deputy U.S. Attorney Robert Hayes asked. "Please tell me Mahone is finally out of the picture." The betrayal was complete. Tony's mentor, the man who'd hired him, trained him, attended his wedding, had been orchestrating his destruction from the beginning. Hayes isn't just covering for corrupt cops, Keene explained as federal agents stormed into the warehouse to arrest Mackenzie. He's the head of the trafficking operation. He's been using his position to identify and eliminate prosecutors who might stumble onto the network. Tony felt 20 years of anger and grief crystallizing into perfect clarity. His father's death, his career in law enforcement, his investigation, his arrest. All of it had been orchestrated by people who profited from the same injustices they were sworn to fight. But Hayes had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated what would happen when a federal prosecutor with nothing left to lose gained access to 2 years of undercover evidence collected by internal affairs. The warehouse became a command center as Keene revealed the scope of her investigation. Financial records showing millions in trafficking profits, surveillance footage of high-ranking officials participating in the network, recorded conversations implicating judges, prosecutors, and police officials across 3 states. "We couldn't move until we had someone with the legal authority and personal motivation to see it through," Keene explained. "Your corruption investigation gave us the framework. Your arrest gave us the excuse to activate everything at once." As dawn broke over the city, news outlets began reporting mass arrests that reached into every level of law enforcement. The story that had begun with a racist arrest at a wedding had become the catalyst for exposing a criminal network that had operated with impunity for decades. Tony stood with Annie in the warehouse doorway, watching Hayes being led away in handcuffs. The man who had tried to destroy his life was facing life in prison for crimes that included murder, human trafficking, and conspiracy. "Your father would be proud," Annie said quietly, her hand finding his. For the first time since the arrest, Tony felt something other than anger or fear. He felt vindication, not just for himself, but for every victim the system had failed to protect. The $11.6 million settlement that would eventually be paid wasn't just compensation for a wrongful arrest. It was acknowledgement that the system itself had been corrupted and needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. But more importantly, the trafficking network had been destroyed, the children it had exploited were finally safe, and the corruption that had poisoned law enforcement for generations was being exposed in courtrooms across the country. 6 months later, Tony Mahone stood before a joint session of Congress, his federal prosecutor credentials restored and his reputation transformed from victim to hero. The man who'd been arrested at his own wedding was now leading the most comprehensive police reform initiative in American history. The hearing room was packed with families of police violence victims, civil rights advocates, and law enforcement officials who supported reform. Annie sat in the front row, now serving as special counsel to the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. "The corruption we exposed didn't emerge overnight," Tony testified. "It was built over decades by people who believed they were above the law. But it was also enabled by a system that prioritized institutional protection over individual justice." The reforms he was proposing were sweeping. Independent prosecutors for all police misconduct cases, mandatory body cameras with civilian oversight, and federal intervention powers for departments with patterns of abuse. Rachel, who had cooperated fully with prosecutors, was serving community service while pursuing a master's degree in victim advocacy. Her testimony had been crucial in dismantling the trafficking network and exposing the legal professionals who had enabled it. Detective Keene had been promoted to head internal affairs for the entire state, tasked with implementing the new oversight protocols. Her 2-year undercover operation had become a model for rooting out institutional corruption. The $11.6 million settlement had been used to establish a foundation supporting families of police violence victims, providing legal aid, counseling, and advocacy services for people navigating the system that had failed them. But perhaps the most important change was cultural. The viral videos of Tony's arrest had sparked a national conversation about police accountability that reached beyond partisan politics. When a federal prosecutor could be humiliated and framed with impunity, it became clear that no one was safe from a corrupt system. As Tony concluded his testimony, he pulled out his father's watch, retrieved from evidence after Hayes's arrest revealed it had been stolen during the traffic stop 20 years ago. "My father died believing that justice was possible within our system," Tony said, his voice carrying across the packed hearing room. "Today, I'm here to prove he was right. Not because the system is perfect, but because good people can still change it when they refuse to accept corruption as normal." The applause was thunderous, but Tony was thinking about the work still ahead. Dozens of cases were being reviewed, hundreds of convictions were being overturned, and thousands of families were finally getting the justice they'd been denied. Annie met him outside the Capitol building, where protesters now carried signs reading "Justice for All" and "Transform, Don't Reform." "So what's next?" she asked, taking his hand as they walked down the steps together. Tony smiled, feeling the weight of his father's watch against his wrist. "We keep fighting. There are corrupt networks in other cities, other states. And now we have a blueprint for exposing them." As they walked away from the Capitol, Tony's phone buzzed with a message from a prosecutor in Chicago. "We need to talk. I think we have the same problem you solved." The work was just beginning, but Tony Mahone was no longer fighting alone. He'd become part of something larger, a movement of people who refused to accept that corruption was just the cost of doing business in America. The man who'd been arrested at his own wedding had become the prosecutor who could change everything. What did this story teach you about the power of persistence in the face of institutional corruption? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world.